story goes. But as we all know, it's never really quite like that. Soon we'll all be fat and overpaid, still not getting laid, and still not afraid of anything that wears a hat. Still, you tell me now.
Most bands split up. They never make it, and their instruments end up stashed behind a sofa or on a guitar shop wall. Bands come and go. Most are forgotten. But these second-hand guitars aren't just expensive, unwanted pieces of wood. Each one is a dream of a past or a future band. People form them for different reasons, because they're mates, because they like the same music, because they want to perform, because they want to get laid, because they're not good at anything else. They may be aiming for something, a record deal, money, fame, or because they're chasing their own personal or collective moment of musical perfection, like an addict. In February 1993, I was 16 years old, and I wandered down a gravel track in Radcliffe with my second-hand electric guitar towards an old cricket hut belonging to the local paper mill to jam with my friend Daz. I'd known him since we were 10, and over the years we'd recorded a few of my songs in my little bedroom studio. Inside the hut I met John, who I remembered from junior school, on guitar, Sqwire on keyboards, and Daz on drums. To call this a band was perhaps stretching definitions a little. They didn't have a name and didn't know any songs all the way through. We had the worst possible equipment. Daz played a battered 1960s drum kit which nobody seemed to make drum skins for anymore. Sqwire hammered away on a cheap and nasty keyboard, and John played a budget guitar with pickups so poor you could actually sing into them, which sometimes he did.
Shut up. Whoa!
We had one microphone which was sellotaped to an upside down table leg because we didn't have a stand, and our amps were even worse than our instruments. One was a karaoke machine with all the buttons missing, housed in a do-it-yourself wooden box with some wiring hanging out the back so we could plug a guitar and vocals into it, and a little battery-powered 4-track mixer. We messed around with chord sequences, not really talking about it, just making sounds together. It's actually amazing we produced anything resembling music given the crap gear we had, but just like that, we became a band. We didn't have a bass player, but there were a couple of famous bands who also didn't have one. Plus, we didn't know anyone who owned a bass. We arranged to jam again, and it soon became rehearsing. I brought a bunch of my songs, and if we could learn and play them without too much effort, they became part of our set list. If we couldn't play them, we moved on to another song. We acquired a name, Aqueous Humour. Not such a terrible name when compared to other berry bands, such as Jeff's Blue Volvo, Engine Room, Gorgeous Swordfish, or Substation Philosophy. And in a tiny wooden cricket hut, we bashed out riffs and sounds for a few hours every week, and there seemed to be some sort of progression, something came together from our disparate parts and crappy gear. This was Radcliffe, and nothing ever happened there. There was no live music scene whatsoever, no record shop, no guitar shop. If there was anything close to an underground scene, it was the four of us. And because of this, local newspapers ran stories on us. The unwritten rule for bands back then was that you had to play other people's songs, and occasionally, on very special occasions, sneak an original composition into the set. Partly because we weren't really good enough to play covers, and partly because I had an enormous list of songs, we began playing original music. This sounds good in theory. I didn't say all my songs were any good. We attempted some truly appalling songs of mine, psychedelic turkeys, tepid mice in spring, minimum vegetable fat, governmental oysters, is the tip included, were just a selection of abandoned songs. Most of these were attempted a few times and never spoken of again. But it was good to write something that sucked and then write something better specifically for the band. There was absolutely no consideration given to how an audience might relate to these songs. Did the average pub bloke fresh from a 12-hour shift moulding plastics on a wet Wednesday night in Rochdale want to hear Life in a Sicilian Ghetto? No, of course he didn't. 2 months after our first rehearsal, we played our first gig in Radcliffe. A half-hour set of original music. It sounded pretty rough, and we could already say we'd played more original music than most pub bands would in a lifetime. In the pre-internet world of the early 90s, things were a little different. Getting hold of simple information on how to fix a guitar pickup or addresses for live music venues was a tedious process involving knowing someone who knew or a trip to the library. And likewise, in the years before everyone had a smartphone, Aqueous Humour left a virtually invisible visual trail of existence behind them. For the whole of 1993, there are less than 10 black and white shots of the band, all of them out of focus, taken by a friend and developed by my English teacher's husband. There's a single filmed rehearsal for 1994, and a few minutes of our only gig that year filmed by a drunk friend who managed to get fag ash all over the lens. Because taking photos costs money, and filming meant expensive VHS video cameras which had to be borrowed or hired, and we didn't have any way of editing the footage after we'd shot it anyway, so very little decent footage exists. But our lack of visual awareness meant we didn't really care what we looked like on stage. Other bands were busy with their image, looking good and sounding crap, having new shiny instruments and backdrops with their name on. One band we gig with actually sold their drum kit so they could buy an apple-flavoured smoke machine to have more of a stage presence. But Aqueous Humour just stood there and played. What we did record was sound. We recorded everything. Rehearsals, sound checks, gigs, band discussions, arguments.
Can't play cricket club at rest of our life, John.
I know, I'm just saying, oh, if my dad's got a birthday, I'm going to try and get them to play. If my dad has a birthday.
Ask him if he can have one next week.
With the record button firmly pressed, we rode the progression of no songs to songs, playing them badly to playing them well. I don't know if it's the same with other bands, but Aqueous Humour consisted of 4 people who didn't seem to share any of the same musical common ground or ideology. We were an unusual collection of musical tastes. John liked Eric Clapton and Paul Weller. Daz liked hip-hop and Pink Floyd. I liked Frank Zappa and Philip Glass. And Cy liked new romantic synth-pop and chart music. The only thing we all seemed to share was the music we played together. If presented as a Venn diagram, certain things would intersect, but only slightly. This huge variation of musical interests meant some days we sounded like this. And other days we sounded like this. And sometimes we even sounded like this. John had a knee injury and broke a finger on his right hand. This meant he spent a lot of time practicing with his fret hand. We carried on playing as a trio, and when he returned, he was an infinitely better guitarist. So in 1995, we booked some gigs. Way too many gigs. 2 a week minimum for the whole year, most of them paid. Thinking about this decades later, it's difficult to imagine the idea of booking gigs directly with venues who pay in cash on the night without a promoter skimming all the money. The 90s were a different universe when I compare the enormous wad of £20 notes from paid gigs to 100,000 streams or downloads in exchange for 0.0004 pence, but I digress. We played local scuzzy pubs, clubs where the bouncers sometimes got beat up, and larger clubs such as Bury's biggest venue where, upon playing, we were immediately banned. We were definitely to blame, but I'm still unsure why the manager thought it would be okay to store cases of champagne in the dressing room, thinking it wouldn't get drunk and sprayed all over like the end of the Grand Prix, which it obviously was. Taking our gig money, we went straight to the studio, and upon listening to the tapes in the hard, sober light of day, realised we didn't really like Si's keyboard playing, which we couldn't really hear most of the time due to the terrible amps. We promptly wiped over his parts with better keyboard playing. We wanted to sound better, and what was the easiest way of doing that? Aside from hoping he broke his knee and fingers and returned a better musician? After 17 gigs, we chucked him out of the band. It was a fairly quick discussion.
What do you reckon I should say? Just say it. Sorry though, but you're out of the bank because crap.
No, you can't sing in a pub and say you're out of the band.
I can. It'll go down in history, won't it?
Yeah, go on then.
We cancelled a few gigs, axed the old songs, learned new ones, and swiftly got a bassist called Neil so we could continue gigging to pay for studio time.
Should do that again? Do that again?
We were brutally efficient in the studio. As I mixed tracks, the rest of the band were copying demo cassettes of the previous mixes. On our way home at 5 AM, we dropped the demos in clubs in Manchester. By afternoon, clubs were calling us to offer us gigs. But once again, the studio recordings highlighted the rubbish bass playing. And 10 gigs later, we threw Neil out too. We had a reshuffle. I ended up on fretless bass and we asked a kid called Jay who I went to college with to join on rhythm guitar. Like previous lineup changes, we binned most of the old songs and replaced them with new ones, whittled them down to a handful of decent giggable tunes and played new venues, smoky pubs which resembled someone's living room, seedy clubs with sticky carpet floors, walking a fine line of listenable but uncommercial music. With songs such as Mouse of the Rising Sun,
Called Mouse of the Rising Sun.
I Don't Like Monkeys, and I Am a Shoe.
I nearly bought a Mars bar from a kiosk today. Maybe someday in the near future I will. I think about water in every way, and if I could even stay still, I will walk upon a dairy farm roof, and I will smile at all the trains. I'll take a picture of J. Edgar Hoover and hope that no hippies complain. Yes, I will walk. Yes, I will take your hair. I will convince you too that I am a shoe.
At the end of 1995, every single gig we played, somebody would ask if we could play an Oasis song, and I mean every gig, sometimes multiple times at the same gig, and it got tedious. Was it just a Manchester thing? Did all Swedish bands get asked to play ABBA, instead of joining the other local bands and playing Wonderwall? We started playing a song which took the piss out of Oasis, when in fact it should have been about idiots in the audience who only wanted to hear cover versions. It was called Get Oasis. The lyrics changed from gig to gig to keep it topical, and after playing it a couple of times, someone claiming to be one of the Gallagher's cousins pulled me aside after the gig and warned us what would happen if we ever played that song again.
I haunt your every hearing like a salty tearing from your eye. Maybe I've got no mind, 'cause I just sing what rhymes, it usually gets by. were cut from the Brits and Patsy cans its tits. They tingle when you play your hits. This you can.
This was overheard by a reporter, and we got a little bit of press out of it. This still didn't stop people asking us if we knew any Oasis songs though. By 1996 there were 2 bands in Radcliffe, and we'd got to a point where we were confident in our own world. And then there was the moment I'd been chasing. The perfect set. The perfect performance. One single night in Bury, in a tiny pub, we were headlining. We played 2 hours of our best, finest, tightest sets of original chunks of music. We were totally at home on stage, knocking back drinks, entertaining the crowd, improvising, soloing, messing around, but remaining tight as if every single rehearsal was leading to this immaculate performance. I remember walking off stage, pouring in sweat, and looking at the tape recorder, which wasn't moving. I'd failed to record our finest moment. Life is like that. 350 tapes of bad or average performances, and then 1 blank tape. Never to be repeated. We played 8 more gigs that year, but that killer moment never happened again. For no real reason, we all just drifted back to our lives of shift work, hard work, and so-called work at university. Me and Jay played together as a duo for a while. The kind of acoustic duo which necessitates press shots taken in fields where we each stare pensively into the distance. But a duo to me sounded like a band missing some members, and the music still seemed to hold the ghost of Aqueous Humour. At the same time, Daz and John were playing in a band together. It's True Man. No, that's what they were called, True Man. I went to see them play, but it was like watching half of Aqueous Humour with some other guys on stage. A first band is like a first love, or at the very worst, a scab you can't stop picking at. In 2000, I found myself back in Radcliffe, which was still near Bury. 1996 seemed like a lifetime ago, and I couldn't remember why we'd stopped gigging, why we'd abandoned this tight little unit of music we had. So for the first time in years, Daz, John and Jay met up at my house to discuss music. We agreed to rehearse again. The first rehearsal was like putting on a pair of battered old shoes. Comfy and snug, it was like no time had passed. Unlike previous lineups of the band, there were new songs, some of them written on the spot as we jammed over a chord sequence. It felt good again. We booked a string of gigs before we even had a full set. We made the local papers again. I told you nothing ever happened in Radcliffe. After 5 rehearsals, Daz called me to say that he was leaving. He said he wasn't that person anymore, as represented by this broken drumstick due to lack of footage. I wasn't annoyed. I didn't really try and persuade him to change his mind. For a couple of rehearsals I played drums and Jay played bass, just so we could plough ahead nearly normally instead of stopping altogether because we'd lost a limb. We found a stand-in drummer called Paul, but I wasn't totally happy. There's a line we all draw somewhere when we decide that a band is no longer the same band. When members leave and new ones join, when members die or are replaced. If Ringo and Paul played a Beatles song live, nobody would call them the Beatles. Some bands do try and do this though, continue with less and less original members for years, fooling themselves that the essence of the band is still intact. And Aqueous Humour without Daz wasn't really the same band I'd joined. And while we may have sounded okay, it wasn't the same organism anymore. I was trying not to be too philosophical about it, but it had been okay to lose Cy or Neil, it wasn't okay to lose Daz. We played the remaining gigs we'd booked in 2000, and that was that. I wasn't sad it was over, because it wasn't really Aqueous Humour that was over. It was something else. The players had changed, the songs had changed, the times had changed, only the name remained. I still believe Aqueous Humour could have made one really amazing album which would have stood the test of time and be a cult classic. But like most bands, we broke up before we got around to making it. Like I said, most bands never make it. They grow up, regard music as a teenage phase. They get married, have kids, drift apart, and forget how good it is. Forget the feeling of a group of people making music. Forget why we do it. And we don't do it to get rich or famous. We do it because we love music. And sometimes to get laid.
Quit your job and then we'll hit the road. It's how the story goes. But as we all know, it's never really quite like that.